The city of New York had seen a lot of impossible things over the years. It had watched alien armadas tear through the sky above Stark Tower. It had survived the collapse of a helicarrier, the rampage of a Hulk, and a sorcerer tearing open portals in the middle of Midtown. The people of this city had learned, through repeated trauma and sheer stubbornness, to run first and ask questions later. So when the ground began shaking somewhere near the edge of Queens on an otherwise quiet Tuesday afternoon, not from an explosion, not from an aircraft, but from a single footstep, the evacuation protocols triggered automatically. Sirens filled the air. Emergency broadcasts cut across every channel. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s orbital satellite array swiveled toward a heat signature that didn't match any known entity in their database. What they saw made the analysts on duty go completely silent. A man in a yellow jumpsuit was walking down the middle of the highway. He was carrying a grocery bag. He looked mildly irritated, the way someone looks when they've realized they forgot to buy soy sauce and the store was already closed. He wasn't running. He wasn't destroying anything. He was just walking slowly in the direction of the city, and every step he took left a shallow crater in the asphalt behind him. Tony Stark saw the satellite feed 11 seconds later. He didn't laugh. He didn't make a quip. He just stared at the pressure readings attached to those footprints and said, very quietly, that this was going to be a problem. He had no idea how right he was, and neither did the rest of the Avengers. If you've ever wondered what happens when an unstoppable force meets a team that's never lost, you need to stay for all 12 parts of this story. Subscribe now, because what comes next isn't a battle, it's a reckoning, and the Avengers are not ready. The S.H.I.E.L.D. analysts had a classification system for unknown entities. Level 1 was a person of interest. Level 2 was a potential threat. Level 3 was an active danger requiring Avenger-level response. In the 17 years since that system had been formalized, they had never gone above Level 3, because Level 3 already meant the world might end. Within 4 minutes of the satellite footage reaching the emergency desk at the Triskelion, someone typed in a query that had never been entered before. They wanted to know if there was a Level 4. There wasn't. They created one on the spot, named it provisionally, and immediately sent a priority alpha alert to every Avenger on the active roster. Tony Stark was already airborne before the alert finished loading on his HUD. He had been running passive scans on the Queen's signature since the first footprint registered, and the numbers coming back from his sensors were doing something they had never done before. They were refusing to settle. Every time Friday tried to lock a baseline reading on the figure walking down the highway, the result came back different. Not because the figure was changing. Because the instruments didn't have a reference point high enough to anchor the data. Tony had built those instruments to measure Thor during a full lightning discharge. They had never maxed out before. They were maxing out now on a man who was, as far as the visual feed could tell, just walking. Saitama was thinking about cabbage. Specifically, he was thinking about the fact that he had walked all the way to the edge of this city, which was not City Z, and was not any city he recognized, but which had a supermarket district that looked promising from a distance, and the supermarket had been closed because of something called an alien incursion last Thursday, according to the sign on the door. He hadn't been there last Thursday. He didn't know what alien incursion they were referring to. He had checked 2 other stores on the way back, and both of them were also closed, one because of structural damage, and one because the owner had simply put up a handwritten note that said, "Not today." Saitama understood the note. He respected it, but he still didn't have cabbage, and the walk back to wherever he had ended up after that last portal incident was going to take a while, and he was mildly, quietly, deeply annoyed in the specific way that only empty grocery bags can produce. He heard the repulsor engines before he saw the suit. He stopped walking, looked up, and watched a red and gold figure descend from the clouds at a speed that was probably meant to look impressive. It landed about 30 meters in front of him on the highway, and the asphalt cracked in a wide circle from the impact, and the faceplate slid up to reveal a man with a well-trimmed beard, who was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who considers themselves the smartest person in any given room and is currently running calculations. Tony Stark looked at Saitama for exactly 3 seconds. He looked at the grocery bag. He looked at the craters behind Saitama's footprints. He looked back at the grocery bag. He said, "Friday, tell me you're getting something useful." Friday told him the readings were still refusing to stabilize. Tony said of course they are under his breath and then activated his external speaker and said, in his most carefully neutral voice, "Hey, buddy. Going to need you to stop walking and talk to me for a second." Saitama looked at him, not with hostility, not with recognition, with the expression of someone who has been interrupted while thinking about dinner and is being polite about it because there's no real reason not to be. He said, "Are you a hero?" Tony said yes. Saitama nodded slowly as if this explained something but not everything and then said, "Do you know if any stores around here are still open? I need cabbage." Tony Stark, who had once talked down an alien warlord, who had survived an atomic detonation in deep space, who had negotiated with gods, opened his mouth and said nothing for nearly 4 seconds. Then he said, "Friday, increase threat assessment to maximum." Because whatever this was, it wasn't going to be simple. On the highway behind them, 3 more suits descended from low orbit. Above the cloud line, a Quinjet banked hard and began its approach. And on a rooftop 6 blocks away, Steve Rogers had already arrived, crouched behind a ventilation unit, shield on his arm, watching through a scope at a short man in a yellow jumpsuit who had just asked Iron Man for grocery directions and seemed completely unbothered by the answer. Steve Rogers had a gift for reading situations. It wasn't a superpower in the technical sense. It didn't come from the serum. It didn't come from the shield. It came from decades of surviving things that should have killed him by paying very close attention to the shape of a moment before it collapsed. He had used that gift on battlefields, in briefing rooms, in burning buildings, and in the middle of alien invasions that rewrote the definition of the word impossible. He was using it now, crouched on that Queen's rooftop with the scope pressed to his eye, and what it was telling him was making the back of his neck go cold in a way he hadn't felt since the first time he saw the Tesseract. The man on the highway wasn't posturing. He wasn't suppressing anything. He wasn't waiting for a moment to strike or calculating an escape route or performing calm the way dangerous people sometimes do to buy themselves time. He was just genuinely, completely, utterly unbothered. And in Steve's experience, there were only 2 kinds of people who looked like that in the presence of an Iron Man suit with weapons deployed. People who didn't understand the danger, and people who were so far beyond it that the concept had stopped being relevant to them entirely. Steve didn't like either option. He clicked his comm and said quietly, "Tony, pull back 10 meters and give him space. I'm coming down." Tony's response was immediate and predictable. "I have this under control, Cap." But even as he said it, the suit took 2 small, involuntary steps backward, which told Steve everything he needed to know about how controlled Tony actually felt. By the time Steve reached the highway, the rest of the team was already positioning. Natasha had come in low and silent from the east, moving along the guardrail with the kind of practiced invisibility that made her genuinely difficult to track even on thermal. Sam Wilson was circling at altitude, wings angled for a fast descent. Bruce Banner was in the Quinjet overhead, which was the right call, because Bruce being on the ground before anyone understood what they were dealing with was the kind of decision that tended to escalate things beyond the point of recovery. Thor had arrived last, dropping from the sky with Mjolnir in hand, and the particular expression he wore when he was trying to look approachable and authoritative at the same time, which was an expression that mostly just looked like someone trying very hard not to smile at a funeral. Saitama watched all of them arrive. He watched the woman move along the guardrail. He watched the man with wings circle overhead. He watched the large man with the hammer land in a way that sent a shockwave across the asphalt and scattered debris for 30 meters in every direction. None of it produced any visible reaction in him beyond a mild turn of the head, the way you might glance at a pigeon that landed closer than expected. He was still holding the grocery bag. He had not put it down. Steve approached him directly, shield lowered, both hands visible, walking at the pace of someone who wanted a conversation and not a confrontation. He stopped about 5 meters away and said, "My name is Steve Rogers. We're not here to hurt you. We just need to understand who you are and why your footprints are doing that to the road." He gestured carefully at the craters. Saitama looked down at them, then back up at Steve, with an expression that suggested he had genuinely forgotten they were there. He said, "Oh, sorry about that. I've been working on it." Steve said. "Working on what?" Saitama said, walking lighter. There was a silence across the entire team's comm channel that lasted approximately 2.5 seconds. Then Tony said, in a voice completely stripped of sarcasm for the first time in recent memory, "He's been working on walking lighter, and he's still doing that to the road." No one responded because no one had anything useful to add. Thor stepped forward at that point, because Thor's approach to unknown powerful entities was fundamentally different from Steve's. Where Steve looked for communication, Thor looked for recognition, the kind that passes between beings who exist on similar levels and understand each other across the gap of lesser things. He planted Mjolnir on the ground beside him and looked at Saitama with the direct, unashamed appraisal of someone who has met genuine power before and knows what it looks like. He said, "Stranger, you carry no weapon, yet the earth bends beneath you. What realm do you hail from and what power grants you this strength?" It was, by Thor's standards, a remarkably restrained introduction. Saitama looked at him for a moment and then said, "I'm from City Z, I'm a hero, for fun." Thor blinked. He turned to Steve. Steve turned to Tony. Tony turned back to his sensor array and said, "Friday, cross-reference City Z with every geographic database we have." Friday came back with nothing. The city did not exist in any database on the planet. That was the moment the situation changed shape. Not because Saitama had done anything threatening, not because he had raised his voice or moved aggressively, or given any indication that he was aware of how profoundly he was unsettling the most powerful team on Earth. It changed shape because Dr. Strange had been observing from a pocket of folded space above the highway since before any of them arrived, running every detection protocol the Sanctum had ever developed, and he chose that moment to step out of the fold and land beside Steve with his cloak of levitation rippling behind him. He looked at Saitama. He looked at the readings on his hands. He looked at Saitama again. And then he said, in a voice carefully controlled to contain whatever he was actually feeling, "Steve, this man is not from this universe, and I cannot find a ceiling on what he is." The highway went very quiet after that. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm was still going off from when Thor landed. Saitama looked at Strange, then looked at the grocery bag in his hand and said, "Does that mean you also don't know where the stores are?" The emergency conference room 3 levels below the Triskelions' main operations floor was not a room that was supposed to exist on any official blueprint. It had been built during the Cold War for situations that couldn't be named in official documents, and it had been used exactly 4 times in its history. Once during a Hydra infiltration, once when the Tesseract readings went critical, once when a SHIELD analyst accidentally made contact with something in deep space that contact protocols were never designed to handle, and once when Nick Fury needed a place to have a conversation that the rest of the world absolutely could not hear. It was being used a 5th time now, and the people in it were not having a good evening. Maria Hill was standing at the head of the table with a tablet in her hand, and the particular expression she reserved for situations where the data she was reading was technically accurate but made no logical sense. Nick Fury was sitting at the far end with both hands flat on the table, looking at the live feed from the Queen's Highway with the stillness of a man who has trained himself not to show what he's actually thinking, and is currently thinking something very alarming indeed. The feed showed Saitama sitting on a highway divider, eating something he had apparently found in his grocery bag. A single onigiri, slightly squashed, that he had retrieved with the focused satisfaction of a man who had found one good thing in an otherwise disappointing afternoon. Around him, at varying distances that all communicated the same thing without any of them saying it aloud, The Avengers were standing in a loose formation that was technically a containment perimeter, and practically a circle of people who didn't know what to do next. Tony's suit had deployed its full scanning array. Thor had not put Mjolnir down. Strange was reading from a text that appeared to be writing itself in real time as he observed, and Saitama was eating his onigiri. Fury said, "Give me the full breakdown." Hill pulled up the compiled data from Tony's sensors, Strange's magical analysis, and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own satellite array, and the breakdown she gave was the kind that made everyone in the room very still. Tony's instruments had attempted to measure Saitama's physical output using 17 different methodologies, and all 17 had returned the same result, not a number, not an error code, but a state the system described as reference ceiling exceeded, recalibration required. The instruments weren't broken. They were working perfectly. They simply had no upper limit to offer because the thing they were measuring didn't have one either. Strange's analysis had been more specific and somehow more unsettling. He had spent 40 minutes running every detection framework the Sanctum's archives contained, frameworks built to map the power of celestials, of abstract entities, of forces that existed at the edge of what the universe considered real. And what he had found was not a power level or a classification. What he had found was an absence of framework. Saitama didn't fit into any existing model of how power was supposed to work, because his power didn't appear to derive from any source. It wasn't magical. It wasn't cosmic. It wasn't technological or biological or dimensional. It was, as Strange had written in his report in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than usual, simply there, in the same way that gravity is simply there. Not produced by anything, not channeled through anything, not explainable by examining its origin, because it didn't appear to have one. Fury listened to all of this without moving. Then he said, "What does he want?" Hill said, "Cabbage, apparently." Fury looked at her for a long moment. She said, "That's not a joke, sir." Dr. Strange confirmed it. He came through a dimensional rift that appears to have opened spontaneously somewhere over the Pacific. He landed in Queens. He was looking for a supermarket, and he's annoyed that they were all closed. Fury turned back to the feed. Saitama had finished the onigiri and was now looking around the highway with the mild restlessness of someone who was starting to find the situation boring. Fury said, "He came through a dimensional rift." Hill said, "Yes." Fury said, "Spontaneously." Hill said the word spontaneously appeared to be accurate, yes, in that Strange had found no mechanism for the rift's creation, and no evidence that Saitama had produced it deliberately. It had simply opened. Fury said, "And our best people can't measure him." Hill said that was correct. Fury was quiet for exactly 6 seconds, and then he said, "Then we don't try to measure him. We try to understand what he responds to." He stood up. "Get me everything we have on entities that don't fit classification frameworks, and get Banner down from that Quinjet. I want his read on this." Hill was already moving. Behind her, on the live feed, one of Tony's remote drones had drifted to within 4 meters of Saitama to attempt a close-range scan, and Saitama had looked at it with the expression of someone noticing a fly, reached out one hand without standing up, and tapped it with a single finger. The drone, reinforced titanium casing, rated to withstand a direct hit from a .50 caliber round, folded inward like a piece of wet paper and dropped to the asphalt in a shape that no longer resembled anything it had previously been. Saitama looked at it for a moment, then looked at Tony and said, "Sorry, was that important?" Tony Stark stood very still inside his suit for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was working hard to stay level, "Friday, log that and tell me we have more drones." Friday told him they had more drones. Tony said, "Good, don't send them." He looked at the remains of the first one. The reinforced titanium had compressed to roughly the thickness of a coin. He had built that casing to survive conditions that would destroy most military hardware. Saitama had tapped it. Not struck it, not punched it, not deployed any visible effort whatsoever. He had tapped it the way you might tap a bug you wanted to move off a table. The readings from the moment of contact, the fraction of a second in which the drone had ceased to exist as a functional object, showed a force output that Friday calculated as somewhere between incomprehensible and a word that Tony generally reserved for theoretical physics thought experiments. He relayed the number to Strange quietly over a private channel. Strange was silent for a moment and then said, "That wasn't full force." Tony said, "I know." Strange said, "Tony, if that wasn't full force." Tony said, "I know, Strange, I know." Above them, the Quinjet began its descent, and Bruce Banner pressed his face to the window and looked down at the highway and the man sitting on the divider and the circle of heroes around him. And something in his expression suggested that the other guy, somewhere in the back of his mind, had gone very, very quiet. By the time Bruce Banner reached the highway, the story had already escaped containment in the way that all stories escape containment in the modern world. Not through any failure of security protocol, not through a leak in the Triskelions' communications network, but through 17 different smartphones held by 17 different civilians at the edge of the shield perimeter who had been filming since the moment Thor landed and sent shockwaves across the asphalt. The footage was everywhere within 20 minutes. Not the classified sensor data, not Strange's analysis, not Fury's emergency classification. Just raw, unedited phone video of a short man in a yellow jumpsuit sitting on a highway divider eating an onigiri while the Avengers stood around him in a circle and visibly did not know what to do. The internet, predictably, lost its mind. Within the first hour, the footage had been viewed 40 million times. Within the second hour, someone had set it to music. Within the third hour, 3 separate governments had called the White House to ask what was happening in Queens, and the White House had called SHIELD, and SHIELD had told them it was under control, which was the kind of statement that becomes technically true only if you define control, in a way that no reasonable person would recognize. Bruce came down the Quinjet ramp with his hands in his jacket pockets and the careful, measured walk of a man who has learned to treat his own nervous system as a loaded weapon. He stopped at the edge of the perimeter and looked at Saitama for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Tony. Tony said quietly, "Don't." Bruce said, "I wasn't going to." Tony said, "You were thinking about it." Bruce said, "I'm always thinking about it. That doesn't mean I was going to." He looked back at Saitama, and what was visible in his expression wasn't the controlled fear that most people showed in proximity to genuinely dangerous unknowns. It was something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable, complicated recognition of someone who understood, in a way none of the others quite could, what it felt like to be a thing that didn't fit inside any framework that other people had built to describe power. He said, mostly to himself, "He's not angry. He's not performing calm, he's just actually fine." Tony said, "That's what makes it worse." Saitama, for his part, had noticed Bruce's arrival the same way he had noticed everything else since landing in this world, with mild interest and no particular concern. He had stood up from the highway divider when the Quinjet landed, not because the Quinjet threatened him, but because sitting for that long was starting to get uncomfortable. And he had spent the last several minutes walking a slow, aimless circle within the perimeter, while the heroes around him adjusted their positions in response to his movement, with the anxious synchronization of people trying very hard to look like they weren't reacting. He had walked past Natasha twice. She had not moved either time, but her hand had moved to her weapon both times and then moved away again, which Saitama had noticed, and which had produced in him a vague, distant sympathy. He recognized the posture of someone who was professionally prepared for threats and was having a bad day because the thing in front of them was not behaving like one. Steve had been trying to restart the conversation for 20 minutes and getting polite, minimal responses that told him almost nothing useful. He knew that Saitama was a hero. He knew that Saitama's hero work involved fighting monsters, primarily alone, and that the fights ended quickly. He knew that Saitama had ended up in this world through a portal he had not created and could not explain, which Strange had confirmed was consistent with his own analysis. He did not know what Saitama wanted, beyond cabbage, or what would happen if Saitama decided he was bored enough to simply leave, or what leaving would look like for someone whose footsteps cracked asphalt without effort, and whose tap had compressed reinforced titanium to the thickness of a coin. He was building toward those questions carefully, the way you build toward the part of a conversation that matters when you know the other person can end it without warning. And he was almost there when the situation changed in the way that situations in New York have a tendency to change from the sky, without warning, and at high velocity. The Leviathan-class drone was not a SHIELD asset. It came in from the north at an altitude that suggested it had been holding pattern above the cloud line since before the Avengers arrived, which meant whoever had launched it had been watching the situation develop and had made a decision that SHIELD's growing inability to classify the threat was itself a threat worth acting on. It was military-grade, autonomous, and armed with an electromagnetic pulse array designed to shut down any technology-dependent entity within a 200-meter radius, which, in the current context, meant Tony's suit, Sam's wings, and every piece of scanning equipment on the highway. It also meant that whoever had launched it either didn't know about Saitama or had decided that removing the Avengers' technological advantage was worth the risk of leaving them without it. Either way, it was a catastrophically bad decision. Tony saw it first, because Friday saw it first, and he was already moving when he shouted the warning. Sam was airborne in the same second. Thor raised Mjolnir. Natasha dropped flat behind the guardrail. Steve brought the shield up. And Saitama looked up at the incoming drone with the expression of someone who has heard a loud noise in a grocery store and is trying to determine if it's worth turning around for. The drone was moving at 600 kilometers per hour. It covered the distance from the cloud line to the highway in approximately 4 seconds. In the 4th second, Saitama raised one hand, without jumping, without running, without any preparatory movement whatsoever, and flicked it. The word flick is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because what it produced was not the casual dismissal it resembled. The drone stopped. Not slowed, not deflected, stopped in midair at the point of contact with Saitama's finger, and then traveled backward at a speed that the SHIELD satellite tracking system later calculated as roughly 4 times its approach velocity, and exited the atmosphere in a direction that would eventually take it somewhere in the outer solar system. The shockwave from the reversal hit the highway half a second later and knocked every loose object within 50 meters flat. Steve caught himself on one knee. Tony's suit registered impacts across the entire front facing. Thor stood straight through it, which was impressive, but Thor's expression when he turned to look at where the drone had been and then look at Saitama was not the expression of someone who was impressed with himself. The highway was silent for a long moment after that. The civilian cameras at the perimeter edge had caught all of it. The footage of the flick of a man in a yellow jumpsuit casually redirecting a military drone into orbit with one finger was already uploading before the shockwave dust had finished settling. Fury watched it happen on the live feed from the conference room 3 levels below the Triskelion and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Find out who launched that drone. And tell the president that I need a direct line in the next 10 minutes, because we are now in a category of problem that does not have a name yet, and I need authorization for options that are not currently on any list." On the highway, Saitama lowered his hand and looked at the sky where the drone had been and then looked at the Avengers and said, "Was that one of yours?" Steve said slowly. "No." Saitama nodded. He looked mildly relieved. He said, "Okay, good." And then he looked down the highway in the direction of the city and said, "Are there any stores open that way?" And nobody answered him, because nobody knew what to say. And the city beyond the perimeter was watching on 17 million screens. And the world was beginning to understand that whatever was standing on that highway in Queens was something it had never encountered before and had absolutely no plan for. The footage of the flick had been viewed 230 million times by the time the emergency session of the UN Security Council convened at 6 in the morning Geneva time, which was the fastest that body had ever assembled for anything that wasn't an active nuclear event, and which told you everything you needed to know about how the people in that room were feeling. The representative from the United States had not slept. Neither had the representative from Russia or China or France or the United Kingdom, and the collective sleeplessness of those 5 people in that particular room had historically preceded some of the worst decisions in modern international history. They had the drone footage, the SHIELD preliminary report, heavily redacted, which fooled no one, and 17 minutes of phone video from the Queen's perimeter that had been analyzed by every defense intelligence agency on the planet in the preceding 6 hours. The analysis had produced, across all agencies and all methodologies, one consistent conclusion, which the American representative summarized for the room in a single sentence that nobody disputed. They had no framework for what they were looking at, no precedent for how to respond, and no guarantee that their most powerful assets could affect it in any meaningful way. The room was quiet after that, in the specific way that rooms full of very powerful people go quiet when they realize that power is a relative concept. The options on the table were, in descending order of sanity, communication, containment, and escalation. Communication was already being attempted by the Avengers on the ground and producing results that were technically positive. The entity was responsive, non-aggressive, and apparently motivated primarily by the desire to find an open supermarket, but which had also not produced any agreement, any understanding of the entity's intentions beyond the immediate, or any indication that the entity would stay in Queens indefinitely. Containment had been attempted once, in the form of the Leviathan drone, and the result of that attempt was currently somewhere between Jupiter and Saturn and still accelerating. Escalation was the option that nobody wanted to name first, but that everyone in the room had already done the math on, because escalation was what governments reached for when the other 2 options felt insufficient. And in this room, at this hour, with this footage playing on the screens above the table, insufficient was exactly how the other 2 options felt. Nick Fury attended the session by secure video link from the Triskelion, which was a deliberate choice, because Fury had learned decades ago that the physical presence of the person making the argument that everyone should calm down tended to have the opposite effect in rooms like this one. He made his case in the careful, measured language of someone who understood that the people he was talking to were frightened, and that frightened, powerful people needed to feel like they were being taken seriously before they would consider not doing something catastrophic. He told them that the entity had been on the ground in Queens for 6 hours and had destroyed exactly one object, which was a drone that had been fired at the Avengers without SHIELD authorization. He told them that the entity had shown no territorial behavior, no aggressive posturing, and no apparent interest in anything beyond finding food. He told them that the Avengers were maintaining a working dialogue, and that pushing the situation toward confrontation before that dialogue had a chance to develop was the kind of decision that looked decisive in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect. He told them all of this in a voice that was calm and controlled and entirely, completely sincere. And then the representative from a nation whose name Fury was not cleared to say in this format asked the question that everyone in the room had been working up to, which was, if the entity decided to stop cooperating, what exactly were the Avengers going to do about it? Fury paused for 1 second. Then he said, "We're working on that." The room did not find this reassuring. The decision that came out of that session was not escalation in the military sense, because the representatives were not entirely without restraint, and because 3 of the 5 permanent members had independent communications with Tony Stark that had made very clear what the sensor data showed and what it meant. The decision was something that sounded measured and responsible, and was, in practical terms, a preparation for escalation, a mobilization of assets to staging positions that kept them out of immediate confrontation range, but brought them within deployment range if the situation changed. Carrier groups in the Atlantic and Pacific. Satellite weapons platforms brought to active status. 3 separate experimental programs that officially didn't exist were quietly moved from storage to readiness. And a request, framed as a request, carefully, because requests can be denied and orders cannot be taken back, was sent to Tony Stark asking him to determine, as quickly as possible, whether there was any mechanism by which the entity could be returned to its point of origin. Tony received that request on the highway in Queens, read it in the half-second of privacy that his helmet's internal display afforded him, and then looked at Strange, who was standing 6 meters away doing something complicated with his hands that involved light patterns Tony didn't have names for. He forwarded the message. Strange read it, and the light pattern stopped for a moment, and then Strange walked over to Tony and said, very quietly, "They want us to send him back." Tony said, "Can you?" Strange said, "I've been trying to find the rift he came through for the last 4 hours. It doesn't exist anymore. It closed when he arrived." Tony said, "So we can open a new one." Strange said, "Theoretically." Tony said, "How theoretically?" Strange said, "Theoretically in the sense that I would need to reverse engineer a dimensional breach using a set of coordinates I don't have, for a universe whose dimensional signature I've never encountered, using energy levels that would make the New York sanctum structurally questionable afterward." Tony said, "So not very theoretically." Strange said, "Not very, no." On the other side of the highway, Saitama had found a vending machine that someone had apparently abandoned during the evacuation, and he was examining it with the focused interest of a man who has been denied food for several hours and is now conducting a serious cost-benefit analysis of his options. He had not asked for permission. He had not indicated that he was about to do anything. He simply looked at the vending machine, looked at the selection, and pressed the button for a can of coffee. And when the machine asked for money, he looked at it for a moment and then pressed the button again. And when it asked for money again, he tilted his head slightly and tapped the front panel with 2 fingers. And the machine dispensed every item it contained simultaneously onto the highway in a neat, even spread. And Saitama picked up the coffee can and opened it and looked at the rest of the items on the ground, and then looked at the nearest SHIELD agent at the perimeter and said, "Do you want any of this?" The agent looked at the spread of vending machine items on the highway, looked at the gently crumpled front panel of the machine, looked back at Saitama, and into his radio said, very carefully, "This is Unit 7 at the eastern perimeter. I'm going to need someone to tell me what the protocol is for accepting a snack from a potential level 4 entity." There was a long pause on the radio. Then a voice said, "There is no protocol for that." The agent looked at the coffee can in Saitama's hand and said, "Copy that." Saitama drank his coffee and watched the city lights come on as the evening settled in around Queens, and if he was aware that 3 carrier groups were moving into position and that satellite weapons platforms had just gone active above his head, he gave absolutely no sign of it. He looked, if anything, slightly less bored than he had an hour ago. The coffee was decent. The order came at 2:47 in the morning Queens time, and it came not from the UN Security Council, which had agreed to hold its position pending further dialogue, and not from SHIELD, which had explicitly argued against it, and not from any of the Avengers on the ground, who had been consulted and had unanimously said no. It came from a joint authorization that existed in a classified framework so deep that even Fury's clearance only showed him the outline of it, a framework built in the years after the first alien invasion for situations where the standard chain of command was deemed insufficient to the scale of the threat. The official language described it as a unilateral stabilization action. What it meant, in practical terms, was that someone with enough authorization and enough fear had decided that 6 hours of a level 4 entity sitting on a highway in Queens eating vending machine snacks was 6 hours too many, and that the time for dialogue had passed, and that it was time to find out what happened when you pointed everything you had at something and pulled every trigger simultaneously. The assets deployed were not conventional. The carrier groups had been a preparation, a staging exercise, a way of feeling in control while the real tools were being positioned. The real tools were 3 things that had never been used together and had never been intended to be used together, because using them together in a populated area was the kind of decision that required a level of desperation that most people hoped never to reach. The first was a directed energy platform in low orbit, a project that officially didn't exist, capable of delivering a concentrated beam of sufficient power to destroy reinforced bunkers from space. The second was a set of experimental sonic disruptors mounted on modified aircraft that had been developed to incapacitate enhanced individuals by targeting the specific frequency range at which enhanced biology became temporarily non-functional. It had worked, in testing, on subjects with capabilities significantly below Thor's level, and the people deploying it had decided that was close enough. The third was a payload of something that Tony Stark, when Friday intercepted the deployment manifest and showed it to him, looked at for a long moment before saying, in a voice very carefully stripped of everything except the facts, "They are about to drop a low-yield nuclear device on Queens." Strange, who was standing beside him, said nothing. Steve, on the other side of the comm, said very quietly, "Tony." Tony said, "I see it." Steve said, "Can we stop it?" Tony said, "Working on it." What happened in the next 4 minutes happened fast enough that the sequence was reconstructed afterward from satellite footage, SHIELD sensor logs, and the accounts of the 12 Avengers and SHIELD agents on the ground. And even with all of that, the timeline had gaps in it that nobody could satisfactorily explain. The orbital platform fired first. The beam came down at 2:51, and it was visible from the ground as a line of light that hit the highway at the coordinates where Saitama was standing with a force that the platform's own targeting system rated as sufficient to level a city block. The beam hit. The highway did not level. There was a sound like the world clearing its throat, and a circle of asphalt around Saitama's position turned to glass from the heat, and Saitama looked up at the sky with the expression of someone who has just been rained on unexpectedly and found it mildly annoying. He was untouched. Not shielded, not deflected, not protected by any visible mechanism. Simply untouched, the way a mountain is untouched by the weather that moves across it, because the weather and the mountain are not operating on comparable scales. He looked at the line of light still connecting the sky to his position, and then looked at Tony and said, "Is that supposed to be doing something?" Tony was already airborne, already broadcasting on every frequency he had, telling the Joint Authorization Command that the platform had failed and to abort the secondary deployment. And for approximately 15 seconds, it seemed like the message was getting through because the sonic disruptors held their position, and the aircraft carrying the third asset held its altitude. Then someone in the command structure made a decision that Tony would later describe, in the most controlled language he could manage, as the single most catastrophically incorrect call in the history of human military strategy, and the sonic disruptors activated, and the aircraft began its descent. The sonic disruptors hit the perimeter first, which meant they hit the SHIELD agents at the perimeter first, and 7 of them went down immediately because the frequency range didn't distinguish between enhanced biology and normal biology, and the agents were very much normal biology. Natasha went down. Sam's wing systems went haywire and he dropped 6 meters before he caught himself. Bruce Banner, who had been maintaining an almost preternatural calm for 6 hours, made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite anything else, and the Quinjet ramp he was standing on bent outward from the grip of his hand. And Tony said, "Bruce," in a very specific tone, and Bruce said, through his teeth, "I'm fine," in a way that meant he was not fine but was choosing to be fine through an act of will that was costing him considerably. Saitama looked at the agents on the ground. He looked at Natasha, who was conscious but not moving. He looked at the aircraft descending toward the highway with its payload, and he looked at it the way he looked at most things, without urgency, without alarm, with the mild, unhurried attention of someone who is deciding whether a thing requires a response. He decided it did. He didn't jump. He didn't run. He simply was not on the highway and then was in the air beside the aircraft, with no visible transition between the two states, and he looked at it for a moment, and then placed one hand flat against the fuselage and stopped it. Not redirected it, not destroyed it, stopped it. Held it motionless in the air at an altitude of 300 meters while the engine screamed against the resistance and accomplished nothing. And then he looked at the pilot through the cockpit glass, and the pilot looked back at him, and Saitama said, in a conversational tone that the cockpit's audio systems picked up clearly, "You should probably land this somewhere." Then he let go, and the aircraft, freed from the resistance, lurched violently before the pilot regained control, and it banked away from the city and the payload did not fall, and Saitama descended back to the highway without any apparent means of doing so and landed without a sound and looked at Tony and said, "I stopped the loud planes. Is the woman okay?" He was pointing at Natasha. Tony landed beside Natasha and ran a medical scan and said, "She'll be fine. Concussion, maybe." He looked up at Saitama. He had been building arguments and strategies and contingency plans in his head for 6 hours, running parallel tracks of analysis and counteranalysis, and all of them had just become irrelevant because the thing he had been trying to plan around had just, without being asked, without any motivation beyond the fact that someone nearby was hurt, stopped a nuclear delivery aircraft with one hand and sent it home. He said, "Why did you do that?" Saitama looked at him. He said, "She was on the ground. Someone dropped her." He said it simply, without drama, without moral weight, the way you state a fact that you consider self-evident. Tony looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the sky where the orbital platform was still holding position, and at the retreating aircraft, and at the 7 shield agents on the ground, and at the circle of glass asphalt where the orbital beam had hit, and he said quietly to no one in particular, "Fury. Tell the Security Council that the military option is off the table, not because we asked them to take it off, because I just watched it fail so completely that attempting it again would be an act of pure fiction." He paused. "And someone get this man some cabbage." Thor had been quiet for 3 hours, which was unusual enough that Steve had noticed it 2 hours ago and had been waiting for the right moment to address it. Thor was not, by nature or by training or by the particular kind of personality that gets forged over 1,000 years of existing as the heir to a cosmic kingdom, a quiet person. He filled rooms. He filled silences. He had opinions about everything, and expressed them with the directness of someone who had never needed to consider whether his opinion was welcome, because in Asgard, Thor's opinion was always welcome, and in every other context, he had simply carried the assumption forward unchanged. The silence he had maintained since the orbital beam failed was therefore not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had something to say, and was deciding whether saying it would make things better or considerably worse, and who had not yet reached a conclusion on that question. Steve found him at the northern edge of the perimeter, standing with Mjolnir at his side, and his arms crossed, watching Saitama from a distance of about 40 meters, with an expression that Steve had learned, over years of working beside him, to read as Thor processing something that didn't fit his existing categories. It was the expression he'd worn the first time he encountered a celestial artifact, and the first time he'd read the full history of Infinity Stones, and the first time Bruce had shown him the mathematical models for what happened to spacetime at the center of a black hole. It was the expression of a man whose framework for reality was very large and very old and was currently being quietly revised. Steve stopped beside him and said, "Talk to me." Thor said without looking away from Saitama, "I have been trying to find the right words since the beam fell." Steve said, "Take your time." Thor said, "There is a story on Asgard, not a legend, not a myth. Those are things we tell to explain what we don't understand. This is older than that. It is told only among the Allfathers, passed through the lineage of those who have sat on the throne of Asgard, and my father told it to me once, when I was young enough that I thought it was a warning story and old enough that I should have understood it was something else." He paused. "It speaks of beings who exist at the end of strength, not beings who have reached great power through training or gift or cosmic circumstance. Beings for whom power is simply the condition of their existence, with no origin and no ceiling, the way existence itself has no origin and no ceiling. Steve waited. Thor said, "We called them the unwritten, not because they were unknown, but because they could not be described in the language of cause and effect. Every word we have for power implies a source. These beings have no source. The power is not something they have. It is something they are." He finally turned to look at Steve. "I did not believe the story was literal. I thought it was philosophical, an Asgardian way of saying that some things are beyond comprehension." He looked back at Saitama, who had found a patch of curb to sit on and was watching the city lights with the calm, directionless attention of someone waiting for a bus. "I no longer think it is philosophical." Steve absorbed this for a moment. Then he said, "Does the story say anything about what they want?" "What they do," Thor said, "that is the part my father emphasized. They do not want in the way that beings with purpose want. They move through existence the way weather moves, not toward anything, not away from anything, simply present, simply acting according to their nature. My father said the only appropriate response to encountering one was stillness, not submission, not confrontation, stillness. The acknowledgement that you are in the presence of something that operates outside the logic of conflict entirely," Steve said. "And if stillness wasn't an option," Thor said, "my father said that question did not arise because the unwritten had never encountered anyone who chose stillness. They had only ever encountered beings who chose confrontation." He paused. He did not describe the outcomes of those encounters in detail. He said the details were not instructive. Only the pattern was instructive. Steve said, "What was the pattern?" Thor said, "That the confrontation ended, and that only one category of participant was present at the end of it." Steve let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "Tony's not going to like this." Thor said, "Tony is going to continue attempting to solve this with instruments. I do not fault him for it. It is his nature, as confrontation is my nature, and I am trying to act against my nature tonight because my father's words are louder in my head than my instincts." He was quiet for a moment. "I went to him earlier, when you were talking with Banner. I wanted to understand him the way warriors understand each other, the recognition that passes between opponents who are honestly matched. I stood in front of him and I looked for it." Steve said, "And," Thor said, "he looked at me the way you look at a tree on a path you walk every day, not unkindly, simply without the particular attention that implies equivalence." He picked up Mjolnir and looked at it, and for a moment something moved across his face that was not quite what Steve would have called doubt, because doubt implied uncertainty about a conclusion you wanted to reach, and this looked more like certainty about a conclusion you didn't want to reach. "I have fought things that challenged me. I have fought things that hurt me. I have fought things that made me understand for the first time that I might lose. This is not that. This is something for which the concept of fighting does not apply in any direction." Dr. Strange had been listening from a distance, not because he was eavesdropping, but because the cloak of levitation had quietly drifted him within earshot while he was running a new analysis, and the new analysis had just finished, and the result of it was the reason he walked over now and interrupted the conversation without waiting for a natural break in it. He said, "Thor, the story of the unwritten. Is it in any Asgardian text? Any written record?" Thor said, "No. That is why they are called the unwritten. Their existence cannot be transcribed without the transcription becoming inaccurate." Strange said, "That's consistent with what I'm finding. I've been running a comparative analysis against every dimensional framework in the Sanctum's archive, and the closest analog I can find is a set of references in a pre-Vishanti text that describes certain beings as existing prior to the establishment of universal law, not violating universal law, prior to it. The laws of physics, the laws of magic, the laws of cosmic structure, these things came into being. This being predates the coming into being, which means all of those laws are simply things that exist around him, the way furniture exists around a person. Present, real, but not applicable." He paused. "I can't send him back, Thor. I've been trying to construct a dimensional pathway using the signature of the rift he arrived through, and every time I build the framework, the calculation tells me the energy required exceeds the total magical capacity of this dimension. not the capacity I personally have access to. The total capacity. The rift that brought him here was not opened by any force this universe contains. It opened because it opened, and revering it requires the same kind of causeless event, and causeless events do not respond to engineering. Thor said, "Then we cannot send him home," Strange said, "not by any means currently available to us." Thor looked at Saitama on the curb across the highway. He said, "Does he know this?" Strange said, "I don't think he's thought about it yet. He's been focused on the cabbage." There was a long silence across the entire comm channel, and then Bruce Banner's voice came through from the Quinjet, where he had gone to sit after the sonic disruptors to keep the other guy calm, and he said, "So we have an entity of functionally infinite power with no apparent agenda and no way home, sitting on a curb in Queens, waiting for a store to open." No one said anything. Bruce said, "I'm going to go talk to him." Tony said, Bruce said, "Not as the Hulk, Tony, as me. As someone who also doesn't fit in any framework and has spent a lot of time in situations where no one knew what to do with him." He paused. "I think I know what kind of conversation this actually needs to be." The Quinjet ramp lowered, and Bruce Banner walked down it with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he crossed the highway in the quiet of the early morning with the city lights reflecting off the glass asphalt where the orbital beam had hit, and he sat down on the curb about 2 meters from Saitama and said, simply, "Hey." Saitama looked at him. He said, "Hey," Bruce said, "You're stuck here, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. Saitama looked at him for a moment, and something moved through his expression that was harder to read than boredom and more specific than discomfort. And he said, after a pause that felt longer than the hour it lasted, "Yeah, probably." Bruce nodded. He said, "That's a bad feeling." Saitama said, "A little." Bruce said, "We're going to try to fix it." Saitama said, "Okay." Bruce said, "While we're trying, is there anything you need?" Saitama thought about it. He said, "Cabbage would be good." Bruce almost smiled. He said, "I'll see what I can do." And he sat there on the curb in Queens in the middle of the night, beside a being that Thor believed predated universal law, and the city breathed around them, and somewhere above them in low orbit, a weapons platform was holding position because no one had given the order to stand it down yet. And no one, in any government or military command structure on the planet, had the slightest idea what came next. Bruce Banner had a system. It had taken him years to build it and more years to trust it, and it was not a glamorous system. It was not the kind of thing that got written up in scientific papers or discussed in the debrief rooms at S.H.I.E.L.D. with any kind of admiration. It was a system made entirely of small, specific choices, the kind that looked insignificant from the outside but that Bruce knew, with the precision of a man who had spent a decade mapping the exact geography of his own worst impulses, were the difference between a conversation and a catastrophe. The system involved breathing at a specific rate. It involved keeping his hands visible and relaxed. It involved a particular quality of attention, wide, unfocused, the kind that didn't snag on individual threats because snagging on individual threats was the first step toward the narrow, accelerating tunnel of awareness that ended with green. He had maintained the system through the sonic disruptors, which had been the hardest test, and he had maintained it through the orbital beam, and he had maintained it through the military aircraft and the 7 agents on the ground and Tony's voice on the comm going tight in the specific way. It went tight when Tony was scared and pretending not to be. He had maintained it through all of that, and he was maintaining it now, sitting on the curb beside Saitama in the quiet of the early morning, and he was doing fine, right up until the moment when something changed. It didn't change because of anything Saitama did. It changed because of something that arrived, again from the sky, because the sky in this story had become a reliable source of terrible decisions, and the thing that arrived this time was not a drone or a weapons platform or a military aircraft. It was a figure that Bruce recognized immediately, because the figure had a specific silhouette that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s threat database had spent 3 years building a file on and still hadn't finished. And the file's summary described it as a being of sufficient power and sufficient instability that engagement was not recommended under any circumstances without a full team in position. The figure landed in the middle of the highway about 20 meters from where Bruce and Saitama were sitting, and the highway cracked in a spiderweb pattern from the landing, and the figure straightened up, and it was the Sentry. Robert Reynolds, or what had once been Robert Reynolds, before the formula and the decades, and the particular kind of psychological deterioration that comes from having the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns, and a mind that was never built to contain it, had been in a monitored facility in Colorado for 11 months following his last uncontrolled episode, which had reshaped a significant portion of the Nevada desert and required a cleanup operation that SHIELD classified at the highest level and never discussed publicly. He had escaped the facility 4 hours ago, drawn by what the facility's psychological team later described as a resonance event, a pull toward a source of power that his own enhanced senses had detected and that his fractured psychology had interpreted as a challenge, a threat, or an invitation. And in Reynolds' case, the distinction between those three things had long since collapsed into a single, undifferentiated compulsion to respond. He stood in the middle of the highway and he looked at Saitama, and his expression was the expression of someone whose internal landscape bore very little resemblance to the external world they were standing in. And he said, in a voice that was trying to be controlled and mostly succeeding, "I felt you from Colorado. What are you?" Saitama looked at him. He looked at him the way he had looked at everything else since arriving in this world, without urgency, without alarm, with the mild, assessing attention of someone who is trying to determine whether the new thing in front of them is interesting or merely loud. He said, "I'm a hero." Reynolds said, "You're not a hero. Heroes don't feel like that. Heroes don't feel like the end of something." His voice was losing its control at the edges, the way voices do when the thing speaking through them is larger than the voice itself. "I have the power of 1,000,000 suns, and I can feel you from 3 states away, and you're sitting on a curb, and I cannot understand what you are, and I need to understand what you are." Saitama looked at him for a moment longer and then said, with the patient tone of someone who has explained something simple many times, "I train a lot. 3 years. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10 kilometers running, every day." Reynolds stared at him. He said, "That's not," Saitama said, "I know." Reynolds said, "That can't be," Saitama said, "I know." Reynolds said, "Then what are you actually?" Saitama said, "I told you." There was a silence during which Reynolds' fists clenched and the air around him began to distort in the way it distorted when the void, the dark counterpart that lived inside Reynolds like a second personality built entirely from destruction, was moving toward the surface. Bruce felt it. He felt it the way you feel a pressure change before a storm, the specific atmospheric quality of a situation that is about to become irreversible, and his system, which had held through everything else, started to strain. Tony was airborne in the same second and on the comm saying Reynolds' name, saying containment protocols, saying everyone back, because Tony had read the Sentry file and knew what happened when Reynolds stopped being Reynolds and started being the other thing, and what happened was not something you survived by being nearby. Steve was moving toward the situation from the west, shield up, saying, "Robert, look at me, Robert, stay with me." Thor raised Mjolnir and lightning began to gather in the clouds above the highway, in the instinctive way Thor's power responded to threat before his mind had fully processed the decision. And Reynolds looked at all of them, and the void looked through Reynolds' eyes at all of them. And then it looked at Saitama, and it made the decision that the void always made, which was the decision toward destruction, because the void existed for destruction the way fire exists for burning, and it hit Saitama with everything it had. The blast was not a directed beam, not a focused strike, not any kind of contained application of force. It was total, the way the sun is total, a release of energy in every direction simultaneously centered on Saitama's position, and it vaporized 300 meters of highway in an instant and blew out every window in a 6-block radius, and set 17 cars on fire simultaneously, and knocked Tony's suit end over end through the air for 40 meters before the stabilizers caught. Steve was hit by the shockwave and carried backward into a concrete barrier that cracked from the impact. Thor went straight into it, because Thor's response to an energy release of that scale was to meet it directly, and he disappeared into the light for 3 seconds that felt much longer. The shield perimeter ceased to exist as a perimeter and became a collection of people on the ground at various distances in various states of consciousness. When the light cleared, Saitama was standing in the center of the vaporized highway on a circle of bedrock that had been exposed by the blast, and he was untouched, and he was looking at Reynolds with an expression that had shifted, very slightly, from mild attention to something that was specifically not irritation, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has been inconvenienced in a way that wasn't worth getting upset about but was worth acknowledging. His grocery bag was gone. He looked at the space where it had been. He looked back at Reynolds. He said, "That had my coffee in it." Reynolds stared at him. The void stared at him. The distinction between the two had effectively collapsed at this point, and what looked out through Reynolds' eyes was something that had destroyed galaxies and unmade worlds, and had never, in any of those encounters, experienced the particular sensation it was experiencing now, which was the sensation of having expended everything it had and achieved nothing. Not deflected, not absorbed, not endured, nothing. The target was simply still there, mildly inconvenienced about a beverage, as if the force of 1,000,000 suns was roughly equivalent to someone bumping your table at a coffee shop. Bruce Banner, who had been thrown 6 meters by the shockwave and had landed on his hands and knees on the exposed bedrock, looked up from that position and felt his system, piece by piece, very quietly disassemble. Not because of Reynolds, not because of the blast. Because of what he was looking at, which was something that the other guy, who had never in Bruce's entire experience been anything other than a tidal force of pure primal aggression toward every threat it encountered, was treating with a quality that Bruce could only describe, afterward in the debrief, as deference. Not fear, not calculation. Something older and more fundamental than either, the response of a force of nature to the presence of something that contained it the way the ocean contains a wave. The other guy knew. And knowing that, Bruce Banner, for the first time in years, did not fight what came next, because if the other guy wasn't going to, there was nothing left to fight with. He stood up, and he was still Bruce when he did it, and he looked at the Sentry, who was staring at Saitama with an expression of total, absolute incomprehension, and he said, in a voice that was very steady for a man who had just survived a god-level energy release from 10 meters away, "Robert, it's over. Stand down." Reynolds looked at him. The void looked at him, and then slowly, like a tide going out, Reynolds came back to the surface because even the void understood on some level beneath language and decision that there was nothing here it could reach. Reynolds dropped to his knees on the bedrock. He said in a voice that was exhausted and small and entirely human, "What is he?" Bruce said, "We don't know." Reynolds said, "How is that possible?" Bruce said, "We don't know that either." Saitama looked at both of them and then looked at the empty space where his grocery bag had been and sighed, a quiet, resigned sound, and said, "I really wanted that coffee." Dr. Strange had not slept in 31 hours, which was not unusual for him. The Sanctum's demands did not organize themselves around circadian rhythms, and there had been periods in his tenure as Sorcerer Supreme that made 31 hours look like a comfortable afternoon. What was unusual was the quality of the exhaustion he was carrying, which was not the physical tiredness of a body that needed rest, but the specific, deeper fatigue of a mind that had been running at full capacity against a problem that kept refusing to have a solution, and that had begun, in the last several hours, to suspect that the refusal was not incidental but fundamental. He was standing in the middle of the vaporized highway section, surrounded by the scorched bedrock that the Sentry's blast had exposed, running his 14th consecutive analytical framework against the dimensional signature he had extracted from the original rift, and the 14th framework was failing the same way the first 13 had failed, and he was beginning to understand that the failure was not a failure of methodology, but a failure of premise. The premise he had been operating on, the one that every analytical framework he possessed was built on, was that Saitama's presence in this universe was an event, something that had happened, with a cause that could be traced and a mechanism that could be understood, and therefore a reversal that could be engineered. Events had structure. Events left traces. Events existed within the web of causality that Strange's training and the Sanctum's accumulated knowledge had spent centuries learning to read. And reading that web was what allowed him to do everything he did, from the smallest spell to the largest dimensional manipulation. The problem, the one he had been circling for hours without wanting to fully face, was that Saitama's arrival did not read as an event on that web. It read as something closer to a condition, a change in the state of the universe that had not been produced by anything within the universe, the way the universe's own existence was not produced by anything within the universe. You could not reverse the universe's existence by applying force to it from the inside, and you could not reverse Saitama's presence by applying any mechanism that existed within the same space as the presence itself. He had one option left. He had known about it for several hours and had been not thinking about it with the focused discipline of someone who knows that thinking about a thing makes it more real, and it had become real anyway because all the other options had expired. The option was the mirror dimension. Not as a containment mechanism. He had already ruled that out, because containing Saitama was not a goal the mirror dimension was capable of serving, as the mirror dimension operated on the same physical laws as the primary dimension, and those laws had already demonstrated their irrelevance to the situation. The option was the mirror dimension as a research environment, a space where he could attempt a form of dimensional surgery that he had never attempted, and that the Sanctum's text described in terms that were more warning than instruction. A direct manipulation of the boundary layer between universes, using the mirror dimension as a buffer to prevent the energy involved from propagating into the primary dimension, and doing the kind of damage that had no recovery protocol. The texts called it threading the seam. They described it as theoretically possible. They also described it as having been attempted twice in the Sanctum's history, and noted that both attempts had been made by sorcerers supreme of considerable power, and that neither attempt had produced the intended result, and that the question of what had happened to those sorcerers afterward was left, in the text, conspicuously unanswered. Strange went back to the Sanctum at 4 in the morning Queen's time, leaving Wang in position at the highway to maintain the observation perimeter, and the minimal ward structures he had placed around the shield agents to monitor for further external incursions. He went to the sub-library, the part of the Sanctum that existed partially outside the primary dimension, and that maintained its contents at a temporal remove that kept them from aging, and he found the volume that contained the threading the seam documentation, and he read it in its entirety for the second time that night, and then he sat with it for 20 minutes in the specific silence of a decision being made. Then he got up and began preparing the workspace. Tony Stark arrived at the Sanctum at 4:47 unannounced in civilian clothes, which meant he had come by car and not by suit, and which meant he had not wanted Friday logging the visit or the conversation. He found Strange in the sub-library with the workspace half prepared and looked at it for a moment and said, "What is that?" Strange said. "Threading the seam." Tony said, "I don't know what that is." Strange told him. Tony listened to all of it, including the part about the 2 previous attempts and the conspicuously unanswered question about the sorcerer's fates, and when Strange finished Tony said, "No," Strange said, "it's the only remaining option." Tony said, "It's the only remaining option that you've identified using a framework that has already failed 14 times tonight. That's not the same as being the only option." Strange said, Tony said, "You're going to try to perform surgery on the boundary between universes using yourself as the primary instrument, without knowing what it costs, without knowing if it works, and without knowing what happens to you if it goes wrong because you're out of ideas and you've been awake for 30 hours and this feels like doing something rather than doing nothing." He paused. "I recognize that feeling. I have done catastrophically bad things because of that feeling. I'm asking you to wait." Strange said, "Wait for what? We cannot measure him, we cannot contain him. We cannot send him back through conventional means. Every military option has failed. Every analytical framework has failed. The Sentry, a being of sufficient power to end this planet, hit him with everything it had, and the only thing it achieved was destroying his grocery bag. What exactly are we waiting for?" Tony said. "I don't know yet," Strange said. "That's not an answer." Tony said, "I know." They were quiet for a moment. Then Tony said, "What do you think actually happens if we just don't? If we stop trying to solve him and start trying to understand him? Bruce is having an actual conversation with him out there. Not a tactical conversation, not an extraction conversation, an actual one. And he's getting responses. Real ones." Strange said, "Bruce is asking him about cabbage and hero work and whether he misses his world. That's not intelligence gathering, Tony." Tony said, "No, it's not. It's something more useful than intelligence gathering right now. It's establishing that there's a person there. Not an event, not a condition, not a dimensional anomaly, a person who is bored and stranded and mildly annoyed about his coffee, and who stopped a nuclear delivery aircraft because someone nearby was hurt, and who has not, at any point in 12 hours of increasingly provocative contact, chosen to escalate anything." He paused. Strange. "What if the right response to something we cannot solve is not to keep trying to solve it?" Strange looked at him. He said, "You're suggesting we accept his presence." Tony said, "I'm suggesting that accepting it might be the only thing we haven't tried yet." Strange was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at the half-prepared workspace, the threading the seam configuration, the open volume with its conspicuously unanswered question. He said, "And if that's wrong?" Tony said, "Then we're no worse off than we were. But if it's right—" He didn't finish the sentence because finishing it felt premature, and Tony Stark had learned, at significant cost, the danger of premature conclusions. Strange did not dismantle the workspace, but he stopped preparing it, which was not the same thing, and both of them understood the distinction. He closed the volume. He said, "I need to show you something first, something I found in the 14th framework before it failed." He pulled up the data on the working surface of the sublibrary, the luminous geometric representation of the dimensional analysis, and showed Tony the point in the framework where the calculation had broken down, the specific node where the mathematics had become self-referential and collapsed. He said, "Every framework fails at the same point. Here. The calculation requires an input value for the upper boundary of Saitama's power, the ceiling, however high, because without a ceiling you cannot calculate the energy required to reverse the rift, and without that calculation you cannot engineer the reversal. Every framework fails because that input value cannot be supplied." Tony looked at the node. He said, "Because there is no ceiling." Strange said, "Because there is no ceiling." He paused. "But look at what the framework produces when it fails. Look at what the self-referential loop generates before the calculation collapses." Tony looked. The loop, in the moment before collapse, produced a single output that Strange had circled in the display. It was not a power reading. It was not a dimensional coordinate. It was a value that, in the mathematical language of Strange's analytical frameworks, corresponded to something specific. And Tony stared at it for a long time before he said, very quietly, "It generates the origin point of the universe." Strange said, "Yes." Tony said, "Every time." Strange said, "Every time. 14 frameworks, 14 failures, 14 identical outputs." Tony said, "What does that mean?" Strange said, "I don't know yet." Tony said, "Neither do I." They stood together in the sublibrary in the 4 in the morning quiet of the sanctum, with the conspicuously unanswered question closed inside its volume, and the framework failure glowing on the working surface. And both of them understood, in the specific way that very intelligent people understand things they cannot yet articulate, that the story they had been telling themselves about what was happening had just changed shape in a way they could not yet see the full outline of. Outside, on the bedrock of the exposed Queen's Highway, Bruce Banner and Saitama were sitting side by side in the early morning dark, and Bruce was asking, carefully, gently, the question he had been building toward for 2 hours, which was whether Saitama was actually okay. And Saitama was quiet for a moment before he said, in a voice that was smaller than anything he had produced in the last 12 hours. "It's just, I was hoping this world might have a monster that could actually put up a fight." He looked at the lights of the city. "It gets boring, all of it, every fight done in one punch. I thought maybe somewhere new." He stopped. Bruce said, "And," Saitama said, "your strong guy hit me with everything." He paused. "It was fine." The words landed in the quiet of the highway like something being set down very carefully, and Bruce felt the full weight of them and understood for the first time, with a clarity that no instrument had achieved in 12 hours of trying, exactly what they were dealing with. Not a threat, not an event, not an anomaly. A person who had become so far beyond every challenge his world could offer that the challenges had stopped feeling like challenges, and who had walked through a rift in reality hopping, with the particular hope of someone who has given up hopping but not entirely, that somewhere out there the world might be different. That somewhere, something might push back. Bruce Banner sat with what Saitama had told him for a long time before he relayed it to the team, and the reason he sat with it was not that he needed to process it. He had understood it immediately, with the bone-deep understanding of someone who knew what it felt like to be a thing that nothing could touch. But because he understood that the way he delivered it would determine how the team received it, and the team receiving it correctly mattered more than the team receiving it quickly. He had watched Tony and Steve and Thor spend 12 hours building increasingly elaborate frameworks for understanding Saitama as a problem, and the thing Saitama had just told him was not a problem. It was a context, and context required a different kind of reception than problems did. So he sat with it until he had the words, and then he opened the comm and said, quietly, "Everyone on channel, I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it without immediately trying to solve it." There was a brief silence, and then Tony said, "That's a concerning preamble." Bruce said, "I know, listen anyway." He told them what Saitama had said, as close to verbatim as he could manage. And he told it plainly, without the clinical framing that SHIELD debriefs used, or the tactical framing that Tony's briefings used, or the narrative framing that Thor used when he was trying to make something comprehensible, by giving it the shape of a story. He just told them what a man sitting on a piece of exposed bedrock in Queens had said about being bored and being stranded and having hoped, without much hope, that somewhere new might be different. The channel was quiet when he finished. It stayed quiet long enough that Bruce checked to make sure the connection was still active, and it was, and he waited, and eventually Steve said, in a voice that was carefully controlled in a way that meant it was containing something, "He came here looking for a real fight." Bruce said, "He came here hopping. He's not sure he actually believed it was possible anymore." Another silence. Then Thor said slowly, "He is lonely." Not as a tactical assessment, not as a strategic insight, just as a plain statement of recognition, the kind that comes from a place that has nothing to do with analysis. He has surpassed everything around him so completely that the surpassing itself has become the prison. Nobody argued with this. There was nothing to argue with. Tony had come back from the sanctum by this point, the conversation with Strange still running in some parallel track of his mind, and he landed on the highway in the gray pre-dawn light and walked towards Saitama and Bruce with his helmet off, and his suit's weapon systems fully stood down for the first time since this had started, which was a choice that his threat assessment protocols flagged, and which he overrode manually. Because some situations required the gesture of vulnerability even when the vulnerability was notional. He sat down on the bedrock on the other side of Saitama from Bruce, which put Saitama between them, which was either a tactically terrible idea or the only correct one depending on how you understood the situation, and Tony had decided he understood it the way Bruce did. He said, "Okay. I've been running numbers on you since you landed, and I want to tell you what I found because I think you deserve to know." Saitama looked at him. Tony said, "I found nothing. Not because you're not there, very much you are, but because my instruments don't have the range. Like trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon. The teaspoon is working fine. The ocean is the problem." Saitama said, "Is that bad?" Tony said, "For my instruments, catastrophically. For you, I don't know. Is it bad to be that strong?" Saitama thought about it for a moment and then said, "It's boring." Tony said. Yeah, Bruce mentioned that. He paused. For what it's worth, and I recognize this is a very small thing to offer someone in your situation, I've never not been able to measure something before. You're the first. Saitama looked at him. He said, Is that good? Tony said. I genuinely don't know. Ask me again in a few days. Saitama seemed to find this acceptable. Steve had been standing at the edge of the exposed bedrock section, listening to all of this. And when there was a natural pause, he walked over and sat down as well, completing a configuration that would have looked, to any outside observer, deeply improbable. 3 people sitting on a piece of exposed bedrock in the ruins of a Queens highway at 5 in the morning, while a city breathed carefully around them, and a weapons platform held position in low orbit, and the entire governmental and military infrastructure of the planet waited for a signal that nobody was sure how to give. Steve said, I want to be honest with you about where we are, because I think you've earned honesty, and I don't think you've gotten much of it in the last 12 hours. Saitama said, Okay, Steve said, we can't send you back, not yet. Dr. Strange is working on it and he's the best there is, but the how of it is still a problem he hasn't solved. Saitama nodded. He didn't look surprised. Steve said, While we're working on it, we'd like to ask you to stay in a place where we can not monitor you. That's not the right word. He paused, looking for it. Saitama said, Keep an eye on me. Steve said, Yes. Not because we think you're dangerous, Saitama said. I am though. Steve stopped. Saitama said, I'm very dangerous. I don't try to be, but I am. He said it with the same plain, unadorned honesty with which he said everything, and the effect of it, of that level of self-awareness delivered in that tone, matter of fact as a weather report, was more arresting than any display of power had been. Steve said after a moment, Yes, you are. And you know it and you're telling us, which means you understand why we're asking. Saitama said, It's fine, I don't have anywhere to be. Thor landed beside them at that point, and he did something that surprised everyone, including, apparently, himself. He sat down. Thor, who sat in battle and stood everywhere else, who treated the act of sitting as a tactical concession that he made only when the fight was unambiguously over, folded himself onto the bedrock and set Mjolnir down beside him and looked at Saitama with the direct, unshielded attention of someone who has decided that the situation requires honesty more than it requires composure. He said, I have been trying to find a context for you since you arrived. A category, a framework, a story I already know that you might fit inside because I am old enough to have a great many stories and I have relied on them perhaps more than I should. He paused. I cannot find one. You do not fit. Saitama said, People say that. Thor said, Does it bother you? Saitama thought about it. He said, I used to think it would be better if someone could, someone who understood. He was quiet for a moment. But I think the not fitting is just part of it. Part of what I am now. Thor looked at him for a long time. Then he said, Yes, I think it is. And something in the way he said it suggested that the statement applied, in some degree he wasn't ready to fully articulate, to both of them. The moment, such as it was, did not last, because moments in this story had a consistent tendency to be interrupted by the sky. And the sky provided again at 5:12 in the morning, when Friday flagged an incoming object on Tony's HUD that the satellite tracking system had been watching since it cleared lunar orbit 40 minutes earlier, and that had just entered the upper atmosphere on a trajectory that put its landing point at approximately the current position of everyone sitting on the bedrock. Tony was on his feet with the helmet sealing before the alert finished. He said, We have an inbound. Large. Biological signature. He was running the identification against every database simultaneously and getting a match that made him very still for a moment before he said, It's a celestial scout. Juvenile class, which means it's still the size of a 20-story building and it's been drawn here by. He stopped. He looked at Saitama. He said, It's been drawn here by you. The power signature you put out. To a celestial, that's a signal. Bruce said, What kind of signal? Tony said, The kind that means something worth investigating. He paused. Or challenging. Saitama stood up. He looked at the sky. He looked at the spot where in approximately 90 seconds something the size of a skyscraper was going to arrive, drawn from the edge of the solar system by the simple fact of his presence. And for the first time since landing in this world, His expression changed in a way that was not boredom or mild inconvenience or patient resignation. It was something smaller and more specific and considerably more complicated. The expression of someone who has been told the ocean might be deep enough after all and is not sure whether to feel relieved or afraid of what that means. He said, very quietly, "How big did you say it was?" Tony said, "Big enough that fighting it in Queens is going to be a problem for Queens." Saitama looked at the city. He looked at the buildings, the lights still on in the upper floors, the bridges, the accumulated ordinary weight of a place where people lived. He said, "We should move it somewhere else." Steve said, "Can you do that?" Saitama said, "Probably." Steve said, "Probably." Saitama said, "I've never tried to move one before, I've only punched them." Tony said, "You've punched Celestials." Saitama said, "One's from my world, I don't know if these are the same." He paused. "They usually go pretty far." Tony stared at him for a moment and then turned to the rest of the team and said, in the tone of a man who has recalibrated his understanding of the universe several times in the last 12 hours and is prepared to do it again, "Okay. New plan. We clear the airspace, we get every civilian asset out of the impact zone, and we let the man who has punched Celestials handle the Celestial." He looked at Saitama. "And you, please try to hit it somewhere that isn't Queens." Saitama looked at him with the expression of someone being given instructions they consider mildly unnecessary. He said, "I know." He looked at the sky again, and in his eyes, for just a moment, something was awake that had not been awake since he arrived. Not aggression, not excitement exactly, but the particular quality of attention that a person gives to a thing that might, for the first time in a very long time, require their full presence. The Celestial broke through the cloud line 90 seconds later, vast and ancient and burning with the light of something that had existed since, before human civilization had words for large. And Saitama looked at it and cracked his knuckles, and the sound of it, in the pre-dawn quiet of the highway, was the loudest thing anyone present had heard all night. The Celestial came through the cloud line at 5:14 in the morning, and the city saw it before the emergency broadcast system could say anything useful, which meant the city responded the way cities respond to things that exceed the broadcast system's vocabulary. With the raw, unmediated panic of 3 million people, simultaneously understanding that the scale of the thing descending toward them was outside the range of anything they had built their sense of safety around. It was not shaped the way human imagination shapes threats. It was not a weapon or a creature or a disaster in any recognizable sense. It was a presence, architectural in its scale, moving through the lower atmosphere with the unhurried momentum of something that had never in its existence encountered a reason to slow down, trailing ionized air behind it in curtains of light that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been attached to something the size of a skyscraper, moving toward a populated borough at terminal velocity. The bridges emptied in 4 minutes. The highway evacuation that S.H.I.E.L.D. had been managing since Saitama's arrival became a different kind of evacuation, larger and faster and considerably less organized. And Maria Hill spent those 4 minutes on 6 simultaneous channels trying to direct the flow of it and mostly succeeding, which was the best anyone could have hoped for. Tony had every asset airborne and moving within 60 seconds of the cloud break. Sam was running evacuation corridors, identifying bottlenecks in the civilian flow and calling them in to Hill's team on the ground. Thor went straight up into the Celestial's path, not to fight it. He had calibrated his understanding of the situation enough to know that buying time was the goal, and that buying it cheaply was preferable to buying it at full cost. But to slow it, to introduce friction into its descent using the full output of his lightning in sustained, focused bursts that would register to the Celestial as something worth briefly attending to. It worked, in the sense that the Celestial's descent slowed by perhaps 12% over the first 30 seconds, which Thor would later describe as the most effort he had ever expended for the least result, and which bought approximately 40 additional seconds of evacuation time, and which was therefore worth every amp of it. Steve was coordinating the ground clearance with the precision and economy of someone who had run large-scale evacuations before, and understood that the most important variable was not speed but direction. Getting people moving in the right direction at a sustainable pace was worth more than getting them moving fast in 4 different ones. Saitama was watching all of this. He was standing on the exposed bedrock where the highway used to be, hands in his pockets, watching the Celestials' descent and watching the evacuation and watching Thor's lightning in the clouds above. And he was doing the calculation that he always did, which was not the calculation Tony did with instruments or the calculation Strange did with frameworks, but the wordless, instantaneous, physical calculation of a body that understood force the way a river understands its banks. Not intellectually, not analytically, but as the condition of its own existence. He was calculating where to be, and when, and at what angle such that the Celestial would go somewhere that was not a city. The calculation did not take long. It never did. He looked at the geometry of the descent, at the Celestial's mass and trajectory, and the location of the nearest uninhabited space large enough to receive something of that size without secondary consequences. And the answer was the Atlantic Ocean, specifically a section of it approximately 200 kilometers east of the coastline, where the depth was sufficient to absorb the impact without producing a wave sequence that would cause its own cascade of problems. He factored in the angle of deflection required to achieve that trajectory from his current position. He factored in the need to deliver the force before the Celestial reached an altitude where the shockwave of the strike would propagate back through the city. He determined that the window for the strike was approximately 8 seconds wide, beginning in 43 seconds, and that the force required to move something of the Celestial's mass at the necessary velocity to reach the target point was a number that he did not think about in terms of numbers, because he had never thought about force in terms of numbers, only in terms of whether it was enough, and it was always enough. And that was the part he had stopped thinking about years ago, because thinking about it didn't change it. He waited. 43 seconds passed. Tony, watching the timeline on his HUD, said Saitama in a voice that was trying to be a warning and ended up being something closer to a question. And Saitama said quietly, "I know," and moved. The word moved is doing the same kind of work that Flick did earlier in this story, and it is similarly insufficient, and the insufficiency is the point. What the satellite footage showed, analyzed afterward at maximum resolution and minimum frame interval, was the following sequence. Saitama was on the ground, and then he was not on the ground, and the transition between those two states produced a pressure wave that traveled outward from his previous position at a velocity that cracked every remaining intact surface within a 100-meter radius and registered on seismic equipment as far away as Philadelphia. He covered the distance between the ground and the Celestial's position, roughly 400 meters of altitude, occupied by something the size of a 20-story building moving at terminal velocity, in a duration that the satellite footage's frame rate could not resolve into individual images. He was simply there, at the point of contact, and then the punch landed. The sound reached the ground 3 seconds after the light did, and the light was significant, a flash that turned the pre-dawn sky noonbright for a full 2 seconds across a visible radius that was later estimated at 60 kilometers. Which meant people in New Jersey saw it, and people in Connecticut saw it, and people on Long Island saw it. And every one of them described it the same way in the thousands of reports that followed. Which was as a light that felt less like an explosion and more like a correction, a sudden and total assertion of a different state of affairs. The Celestial stopped moving toward the city. It did not slow gradually. It did not deflect gradually. It stopped at the moment of contact, and then it moved in the direction it had been sent, which was east, and it moved at a velocity that the satellite tracking system could not initially process because the system's maximum tracked velocity was calibrated for objects in near-Earth orbit, and the Celestial was moving faster than that within the first second of contact. It cleared the coastline in 4 seconds. It hit the water in 11. The impact displaced enough ocean volume to register on the geological monitoring systems of 3 continents as a significant seismic event of non-tectonic origin, and the wave sequences it produced were substantial enough that coastal warning systems activated across a 1,000-kilometer stretch of the Atlantic. And the monitoring agencies that received those readings spent several very confused hours trying to determine what kind of object hitting the ocean floor at that velocity from that direction could produce that signature. And the answer their models kept returning was nothing we have a category for, and they were correct. The shockwave from the punch reached the highway in a form that had been substantially attenuated by distance and the intervening atmosphere, and substantially attenuated, in this context, meant it was still sufficient to knock Tony's suit off axis for 2 seconds and blow out every remaining window in a 4-block radius, and produce a sound that the acoustic monitoring stations at JFK Airport logged as the loudest single event in their recorded history. Thor, who was closest to the point of contact and had been moving to assist when the punch landed, simply stopped in midair and watched the celestial recede toward the Atlantic horizon at a velocity he had no reference point for, and was quiet for a long moment before he said, on the open comm channel, in a voice that was entirely stripped of everything except the plain observation, "He is not punching with strength. He is punching with ending." Saitama descended back to the bedrock in the same inexplicable way he had ascended from it, without visible mechanism, without sound, landing in the center of the exposed section, and standing there in the gradually brightening pre-dawn light with his hands back in his pockets, and his expression returned to its default state of mild, resting calm. His suit was not damaged. His hair was not disturbed. He looked, if anything, slightly less relieved than he had looked immediately before the punch, which was the expression of someone who has tested something and found it, once again, insufficient to the need that prompted the test. He had hit it as hard as he hit everything. The celestial had gone where he sent it. The city was intact. Everything had gone exactly as expected. And the expectation, once again, had been met without resistance, without complication, without the particular quality of reciprocal force that would have told him even once that something out there was pushing back. He stood in the quiet that followed his own punch, and the quiet was absolute and familiar and unchanged from every quiet that had followed every punch in the 3 years since the training had ended, and the power had arrived, and the world had become, irreversibly, small. Bruce was the first one to reach him, because Bruce had been watching from the bedrock and had not moved during the evacuation, which was either foolish or the most honest thing anyone had done all night. And he walked to where Saitama was standing, and he stood beside him, and he didn't say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. Then he said, "You got it clear of the city." Saitama said, "Yeah." Bruce said, "Everyone's okay." Saitama said, "Good." He looked at the brightening horizon over the Atlantic, the direction the celestial had gone, and Bruce looked at his face and understood, with the full weight of his own experience behind the understanding, exactly what the expression on it meant. It was the expression of someone who had just done the most significant thing they were capable of doing and found it, once again, enough to solve the problem and nowhere near enough to fill the space that the problem had temporarily occupied. He said it didn't push back. Saitama said, "No," Bruce said quietly, "I'm sorry." Saitama looked at him. He said, "It's okay." He paused. "I'm used to it." And in those 4 words, delivered in that tone, with that expression, was the entire weight of what it meant to be what he was, not the power, not the scale of it, not the number of things it had ended without effort, but the loneliness at the center of it, the absolute, unassuageable loneliness of a person for whom the world, every world, was made of things that broke before they could matter. Tony landed beside them a moment later, and he stood there in his suit in the wreckage of the highway with the sunrise starting over the Atlantic and the city's emergency lights still flashing in every direction and the geological monitoring systems of 3 continents still processing the event. And he looked at Saitama and he said, "I got a reading." Saitama looked at him. Tony said, "On the punch. 1 reading, 1 fraction of a second before my instruments did what they always do and failed." It's not complete data, it's not enough to work with scientifically, but it's enough to give Strange a different input value for his framework. He paused. It might not change anything. The math might fail the same way it's been failing, but it's something we didn't have 8 minutes ago. Saitama said, "You think it helps?" Tony said. "I think it's the first real data point I've gotten since you landed, and I think that means something, even if I don't know yet what." He looked at the horizon. "Strange is already running it," Saitama nodded. He looked at the sky, the lightning depth of it, the place where the celestial had gone. He said, "If it works," Tony said, "if it works, we find a way to send you home." Saitama said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "While you're working on it, is there anything open yet? I still need cabbage." Tony Stark looked at him. This man who had just hit a juvenile celestial into the Atlantic Ocean and was now standing in the ruins of a Queen's highway asking about grocery stores. And he made a decision that bypassed every analytical framework and every strategic consideration and operated purely on the human frequency. And he said, "Yeah, I know a place. Come on." And they walked, the three of them, away from the bedrock and the glass asphalt and the weapons platform, still holding position overhead, into the gradually brightening morning of a city that was still standing because of a punch that had changed every number Strange was working with. And the world did not know yet what that meant, but it was about to find out. Strange got the result at 7:43 in the morning, which was 2 hours and 51 minutes after Tony had sent him the punch data. And the result was not what he had expected, which was itself significant because Strange had trained himself over decades to have precise, calibrated expectations, and to be surprised only by things that operated outside the boundaries of his training. And the boundaries of his training were very wide. He was in the sub-library with Wang standing behind him and the working surface covered in the luminous geometry of the revised framework. And when the calculation completed and the output appeared, he looked at it for a long time without speaking, and Wang, who had learned to read Strange's silences the way navigators read weather, said, "Good or bad?" Strange said, "Neither. Different." He looked at the output again. The punch data gave the framework an anchor point. Not a ceiling, there still isn't one, but a single confirmed instance of output magnitude that allowed the calculation to proceed past the node where it kept collapsing. He paused. "The framework completed," Wang said, "and," Strange said, "and it tells me that a return pathway is theoretically achievable, but not through any mechanism this universe's magical infrastructure can generate from within." He let that sit for a moment. The pathway has to be opened from the other side. Tony took this in over the phone without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "From Saitama's universe," Strange said. "From wherever he came from, yes. The rift that brought him here was not random. The framework's completed calculation shows a directionality to it that I missed before because I was looking for a mechanism, and directionality isn't a mechanism. It's an orientation. Something in his universe generated a pull. Not a push, he wasn't sent here, he was drawn here, and the drawing originated on the other side." Tony said, "Something in his universe pulled him here," Strange said, "or someone." Tony said, "Does he know about this?" Strange said, "I haven't told him yet, I wanted you to have it first." Tony said, "Why?" Strange said, "Because telling him means telling him he might be able to go home, and I want that conversation to be handled carefully, and you were already with him." He paused. "How is he?" Tony looked across the diner table at Saitama, who was eating a bowl of rice with a fried egg on top and reading the back of a soy sauce bottle with the focused attention of someone who has nothing else to do and has decided that the soy sauce bottle is interesting enough to fill the time. Tony said, "He's fine. He found a diner that was open." Strange said, "Tell him. But tell him everything, including the part we don't know yet, which is what generated the pull and whether it can do so again and whether the pathway, if it opens, is stable enough to be usable." Tony said, "You want me to give him hope with significant caveats?" Strange said, "I want you to give him truth, which happens to contain hope and significant caveats simultaneously." Tony said, "That's not a comfortable thing to deliver." Strange said, "No, it rarely is." Bruce was the one who told him in the end, because Tony had looked at Saitama across the diner table and understood, in the particular way that Tony understood things he didn't want to admit, that the conversation required a quality of plainness that he was not constitutionally capable of, and Bruce was. He flagged Bruce with a look, and Bruce, who had been watching Tony process the phone call from the other side of the table, nodded once and set down his coffee and said, "Saitama, we have something." Saitama put down the soy sauce bottle. He looked at Bruce with the calm, patient attention he gave everything, and Bruce told him what Strange had found, all of it, the completed calculation and the directionality and the pull from the other side and the parts they didn't know yet, and he told it simply and completely, the way you tell someone something important when you respect them enough to not soften it. Saitama listened to all of it without interrupting. When Bruce finished, Saitama was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Something pulled me here." Bruce said, "That's what the math says." Saitama said, "From my world." Bruce said, "From wherever you came from, yes." Saitama said, "Do you know what?" Bruce said, "Not yet." Saitama thought about this. He said, "In my world, things like that, things that reach across dimensions, they're usually monsters." He said it with the same plain, matter-of-fact tone that he used for everything. But underneath, it was something that Bruce recognized as the specific quality of hope that has learned to be careful about showing itself. The hope of a man who has stopped expecting good outcomes but hasn't entirely stopped wanting them. He said, "A monster that could reach across dimensions. That would be something." Bruce understood exactly what he meant, and the understanding sat in him like something warm and slightly painful simultaneously. He said, "Yeah, it would be." The rest of the morning moved in the particular rhythm of aftermath. The rhythm of things being assessed and counted and reported and responded to. The rhythm of a city taking stock of itself after a night that had exceeded every framework it had for exceptional nights. The damage to the Queen's Highway was significant and structural. 3 city blocks of surface road reduced to exposed bedrock and glass asphalt, and the kind of subsurface disruption that the engineering teams sent to assess it described, in their preliminary reports, using the word unprecedented, 17 times in 14 pages, which set a record the report's author was not happy about. The Atlantic Impact Site was generating ongoing seismic data that the monitoring agencies were still trying to contextualize, and the wave sequences had been sufficient to require coastal advisories across a significant stretch of the eastern seaboard, though the waves themselves had dissipated before producing serious damage. Because the strike had been aimed with a precision that had accounted for wave propagation in a way that nobody had explicitly asked for, and that nobody could quite explain except by reference to the person who had made it. The Sentry was in custody, returned to his facility in Colorado under a revised containment protocol that the facility's team had spent the night designing, and that everyone involved understood was less a containment solution than a statement of intent. 7 SHIELD agents had been hospitalized with the sonic disruptor's effects, all expected to make full recoveries. Natasha had a concussion and was annoyed about it. The orbital weapons platform had finally been stood down at 6:15, after Fury had a conversation with the Joint Authorization Command that he would later describe only as clarifying. Nick Fury arrived at the diner at 8 in the morning and sat down at the table where Tony and Bruce and Saitama were finishing breakfast, and he looked at Saitama for a moment with the direct, unreadable assessment of a man who had spent his entire career looking at things that didn't fit frameworks and deciding what to do with them. Then he said, "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've seen things that required me to revise everything I thought I understood about the nature of threat, the nature of power, and the nature of the people who carry both." He paused. "Last night required me to revise things I didn't know I still had assumptions about." Saitama looked at him. Fury said, "I'm not going to pretend that the last 12 hours were handled well, because they weren't, and the people responsible for the parts that weren't handled well are going to have conversations they're not going to enjoy. What I want to know from you directly is whether you intend to be a problem while you're here." Saitama considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "No." Fury said, "Are you going to be difficult to work with?" Saitama said, "Probably sometimes." I don't always understand what people want from me. Fury said, "That's honest." He said it with something that was close to respect. He said, "Strange tells me there might be a way home for you eventually." Saitama said, "He thinks something from my world pulled me here." Fury said, "That concerns you." Saitama said, "I don't know yet." He looked at his empty bowl. "It might be something worth fighting if it is." He paused. "I'd like to get there in one piece." Fury looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "We'll do what we can to make that happen." He stood up. He put a shield identification card on the table, the kind with a temporary clearance designation that had been issued, to Strange's knowledge, exactly 4 times in the organization's history. He said, "That gets you into any shield facility and any shield food service, which is going to be better than diners for the duration." He looked at Tony. "Make sure he has what he needs." Tony said, "Already on it." Fury looked back at Saitama one last time, and in his expression was the particular quality of a man who has encountered something he cannot categorize and has made a decision to stop trying to categorize it and start trying to work alongside it instead, which was, given everything that had happened, a more significant decision than it might have looked. He left. The world that existed after Fury walked out of that diner was not the world that had existed before Saitama walked down a Queens highway at 3 in the afternoon the previous day. It was different in ways that the news cycle was still trying to articulate, and that the government reports were still trying to classify, and that the people on the street in Queens were still trying to process, looking at the exposed bedrock and the glass asphalt and the space where a celestial had briefly been. SHIELD had a new classification category, Level 4, and it had 1 entry. The UN Security Council had a new working group whose mandate was, in the careful language of the founding document, the development of frameworks and protocols for engagement with entities operating outside existing power classification systems, which was a long way of saying that the world had acknowledged, in the formal, bureaucratic, institutionally cautious way, that the world acknowledges things it would rather not, that the frameworks it had built to understand power were insufficient, and that this insufficiency was now on the record, and that living with it was now the project. Dr. Strange had a new line of research that he would spend the next several months pursuing with the focused, sustained intensity he brought to problems that genuinely exceeded his current understanding, which was the research into the nature of the pull, what had generated it, where it had originated, and whether it was still active, and whether the thing that had reached across dimensional boundaries to draw one person from one universe to another was something that could be found and understood and, if necessary, stopped. And Saitama had a shield identification card in his pocket and a bowl of rice in his stomach and a city around him that was still standing and an ocean to the east that contained a celestial he had sent there without breaking a sweat. And somewhere in his universe, something had reached for him, and he didn't know yet whether it was a monster or a miracle, but the not knowing had a quality he hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the quality of a question that might actually have an answer worth waiting for. He left the diner at 8:17 in the morning and walked east toward the waterfront, hands in his pockets, stepping over debris with the careful, deliberate step of a man who was still working on walking lighter, and the city moved around him in its complicated, layered, enormously indifferent way, and he did not look threatening or triumphant or purposeful. He looked like someone taking a walk. But the footprints he left in the concrete of the sidewalk, each one a shallow, perfect impression of a boot sole pressed a centimeter into solid stone, told a different story to anyone who thought to look back at the path behind him. The story of a presence that the world would not return from, a before and after that had been established not through destruction or conquest or any of the usual mechanisms by which befores and afters get made, but through the simple, total, irreversible fact of arrival. He was here. The world knew it, and the world, in all its governmental and military and analytical complexity, had tried everything it had to change that fact, and had produced, across 12 hours of escalating effort, exactly nothing except a celestial in the Atlantic and a new category